My name is Daniela Maciel. I go to Summit Collegiate High School, and the title of my documentary is Where the City Drew the Line. My documentary revolves around redlining in Fresno, California, as it's a historic discriminatory act that was put around neighborhoods. I chose this topic because I learned about it in my ethnic studies class junior year of high school, and I decided to look more into it on my own research. I hope my documentary can show more of the issues around California, especially in the Central Valley.
Why did you select Levittown to live?
We were looking for a place to buy a home. We looked at Levittown, and we liked the homes here. We liked the advantages that Levittown seemed to offer in comparison to other cities. And we understood that it was going to be all white, and we were very happy to buy a home here.
Do you think a Negro family moving here will affect the community as a whole?
Definitely.
In what way?
I think that, well, the property values will immediately go down if they are allowed to move in here in any number.
One of the drivers of that wealth gap is redlining, the practice of mortgage lenders denying loans to people based on their race or where they live, with those areas marked with red lines on maps. Although the practice was outlawed in 1968, its effects are still being felt today.
So redlining refers to the practice of, historically the practice of underwriters would go out to neighborhoods and assess the neighborhood as a whole for its level of risk for giving out homeowner loans.
So they would create maps of pretty much every city in the U.S. Blue for like the safest, best investment. The areas that were hatched in red lines were considered to be a bad investment, declining neighborhood.
My name is Dr. Amber Crowell. I'm an associate professor of sociology at Fresno State. My research is on residential segregation and housing inequality and other related social inequalities. So I focus on what drives residential segregation patterns, what explains them, why do they vary from one place to another, and most recently I have a project that is mapping historical patterns of segregation in urban areas to connect that to the present day.
My name is Dan Zach. I'm the president and principal planner of an urban planning consulting company called Zach Urban Solutions that I founded about a year and a half ago. I'm based in Fresno, California. I was born and raised here, and I've been practicing urban planning for about 26 years now.
Our Salute City has grown literally from 2,000 acres of golden grain to a modern community of nearly 160,000 people. Fresno, California, recognized throughout the world as the agribusiness capital.
So the federal government post-World War II was making it easier for people to buy homes. It was very focused on rebuilding the middle class after the war. At the time that those loans were coming out from the federal government, they sent out these underwriters to determine which neighborhoods are the best, which neighborhoods are the riskiest to give out these loans. And this was before the civil rights movement. This is before we had civil rights laws like we do today. There were no fair housing laws. And so the underwriters, when they would go out to neighborhoods in urban areas, and Fresno was one of the cities that they came to, one of the things that they would take into account was the racial composition of the neighborhood. And so if they saw that the neighborhood was predominantly Black or Mexican or Chinese, or here in Fresno, even Armenian, so some groups that today would be considered white, they considered racial minorities at the time, they would then systematically rate those neighborhoods as the riskiest.
A lot of homes were sold with covenants recorded against the deeds that prohibited people from selling their homes to African Americans, Latinos. In Fresno, we even see old covenants on old deeds barring the sale of your home to former subjects of the Ottoman Empire, which was shorthand for Armenians.
It's not legal anymore. In fact, California passed a law that is requiring counties to strike the language from the deeds.
And you could not sell your home to folks from those different backgrounds. And so that was a way of like, hey, we want to keep this neighborhood wealthy and white, and force that discrimination through the deed.
It affected primarily people of color, and it most affected Black people. Other groups over time, found opportunities to kind of leave those neighborhoods, and they're not as segregated as black households are. So it primarily affected black households, but other groups were affected as well. And realtors were part of it too. So when a black family would go out to buy a home, a realtor would literally steer, it's called steering, would steer them away from those neighborhoods and say, no, 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 you can't, look at these homes. And so there are all these different tactics that were used to keep them out. In 1918, the city of Fresno passed their first general plan. The general plan determines how a city gets developed, where things get placed, where there's going to be new residential development, where there's going to be new commercial development, right? It's a plan that they follow. At the time, Chinatown in Fresno already existed, which isn't too far from here. So Chinatown was the part of the city where Chinese laborers were forced to live. They weren't allowed to live anywhere else. That also eventually ended up being where black folks were forced to live. A lot of Mexican laborers ended up living too. When the city drew out their general plan, they needed a place to put their industrial development, the factories, the warehouses. And where they put it was where Chinatown was. They put it all around Chinatown, which meant all those factories and warehouses and places that pollute and that make neighborhoods unhealthy were intentionally put where these folks were already living. Then the freeways started getting built. And so freeways, when deciding where to put those freeways so that people could get from their suburban homes into the central city, the places they decided to put them were places where people of color lived, that had already been redlined, that had already been determined of places where you don't invest anyway. So those freeways cut right through their neighborhoods.
In terms of displacing disadvantaged neighborhoods and slicing right through, they didn't slice the freeways for the most part through wealthy neighborhoods, right?
Over time, as we became more dependent on cars and trucks, all that pollution is just primarily spilling out into those neighborhoods. And if you look at any health issues like asthma attacks or cardiovascular disease, you'll see that it's way more prevalent in those neighborhoods where the freeways are, where the warehouses are, where the industrial development is. And then the neighborhoods that they rated as the best, there were neighborhoods where they were mostly white, almost exclusively white. They tended to be wealthier white people, so working class white neighborhoods would get rated a little lower, but still better than the neighborhoods where racial minorities lived. And then that determined who got money from the federal government to buy a home. Owning a home is the main way that Americans gain wealth. It's the main way that we accumulate wealth. If you're not born into wealth, then buying a home is how you develop a base of wealth. So for white folks in the 1940s and 50s, this was, a free ticket basically into building wealth. And for black folks and for people who are Mexican and Chinese, they were completely shut out of that opportunity. Those families that were shut out of opportunities, 70, 80 years ago, they couldn't build wealth over time. And the families who could buy homes, they've amassed wealth over generations. There's an ongoing issue with Southwest Fresno and the city's attempt to rezone it for industrial use, which sounds like just history repeating itself, right? The whole problem started when the first general plan zoned Southwest Fresno for industrial use, and now here we are again 100 years later. So we're all taught, we go into adulthood thinking these things, and it's only really if you get in a space where suddenly we're talking about the larger structural issues that you realize, oh, it's more than just me, and there are actually these sort of structural things happening that are shaping my trajectory, and where I'm heading is not where this person's heading because they have all these different opportunities available to them. I think for a lot of families, especially immigrant families, education is still the route that they lift themselves up. And my choices are, yes, my choices, but I don't have the same set of choices that this person has.